So we're going to go to our breakdown in John here, starting off in chapter 1, going through chapter 10, and right off the bat, we have this thing that's unique to John, where Jesus is this pre-existence of Jesus with God at the time of creation, and they labeled Jesus with the name Word, a capital W. Jesus is the Word. The Word was with God. What does that mean to you? If somebody would ask you, what does that mean? What would you say? What would you say to that? How would you explain that to people? I think that's one of those, there's so many different labels for how we, in Scripture, for how they talk about God, how they talk about Jesus. And each one is to help to kind of bring us, to give us a closer idea of who Jesus is, who Jesus truly is. And the Word is one of it. I think for me, you can read the Scriptures, you can study Moses, you can look at the prophets, you can look at Paul, you can do all that. But Jesus is the embodiment of what God wants us to be, right? He is the reflection of God, and we are to reflect Jesus. And so everything I read, study, all the stories I hear, Jesus is the living Word of all this coming together, what God actually wants us to look like and be like. If I never could read, as long as I heard the stories about Jesus, I would know how to be a Christian, how to be a follower. And that's the people in those days. People couldn't read. They didn't have Bibles on their nightstand. And so it's through the stories that they came to know who Jesus was and what they were to do in response to Jesus's message and in response to the resurrection. So that's where we kind of at with chapter 1. Chapter 2, we get in the miracle of water to wine. He's at the wedding banquet, and mom wants that wine made, and he honors mom's request. No, he doesn't seem to be super happy about it. It's not the way Jesus wants to reveal himself. He's got bigger plans than just turn water into wine, but this is where we can find that story. I believe it's only in this gospel where we find that. That's where it is. And then it goes right into the flipping of the tables in the temple. And you see this through other gospels as well. John places it in a different location in the story. It's really out of order. Again, John doesn't care about historical order of events, and this would be an example of that. So, but this is where we find this story, and John. But I always think anytime we come across this, it is a interesting story that should challenge us. To think about, are there times in which we sell out our own faith, our church, our way of being? Do we allow things in our space to occur and happen, even though we know it's wrong? We know the behavior is wrong. We know the attitude is wrong. We know the heart is wrong, right? I'm thinking about people who, came from a church who they didn't care who the minister was as long as the minister was a man. So are we willing to stick to the status quo, even if that means keeping the women at a lower status inside our church? And in our church, obviously, women are equal. Like, we put women in leadership. We don't have that patriarchal system in our church, but that would be an example. There came a time where we had to flip that table and make that choice to lift women up in equal setting. That same church wouldn't hire a male pastor because that pastor was black. Are we willing to not allow different, maybe worship styles or different ways of worship and praise, or different people to have a lead in our church because of the race, because of their sexuality, right? Yeah, there came a time where we had to flip that table and to allow equal footing for black preachers, women preachers, gay preachers, to not only have a place in our churches to be ministers, but also to be leaders. There was a time it was white straight men. You were the leaders, and so we had to flip that table. Are there tables that we still need to flip and still need to create some discomfort, to create that change, to allow us to live a little more like Jesus, to build out this bigger inclusion, this life that Jesus invites us all to, right? All of us are invited into this life. So those are courageous moments, and those are moments that we should be looking for even today, to make sure that we are living out as that embodiment of the church, that embodiment of Christ's love to others. So it's always a great story that should stir some emotion and some thought for us. Chapter 3. You get the encounter with the Pharisee Nicodemus. Jesus makes this really kind of neat statement about the wind. He says the wind blows where it wants, yet we do not know where it comes from or why. I equate this to the Spirit, right? The Spirit moves the same way with people. We don't always know how the Spirit works. We don't know why certain people are called. or where they're coming from, or why, what is going on, like why this person. There's times I've asked myself that of my own ministry I'm doing, like I cannot believe I've been called to do this. I just sometimes feel like one of the last people that should be. But thank God for the grace and love and mercy of God. And I think sometimes we may not always know how the Spirit's moving with us or with others, but can we recognize it? Can we acknowledge it? Can we lift it up? Can we see that in ourselves, see the good in ourselves and the good that we can do? We don't always know why, where, or how it's going, or where it's going to go, but it's there, it's present in our life, and we get this little moment here in chapter 3 about that. Chapter 4, we get the Samaritans. We get this story about the Samaritans and Jews. They were talking about chapter 4. They were not allowed to marry. It was against the law for a woman to speak to a man alone, because you have Jesus at the well with this Samaritan woman. That would have been odd to see him doing that. They weren't allowed to marry. They weren't allowed. A woman was not allowed to speak to a Jewish man like that by themselves. And Jesus again kind of breaks that mold, and kind of just meets people where they are, to allow himself to be revealed to these people at times that he's told, you shouldn't do that. To me, it just strengthens that Jesus was here, real, doing the real thing, because he constantly speaking to people that don't hold much status, or people he's not supposed to, and somehow his legend, right, his stories, what he does builds and grows throughout the land, and people can't wait to encounter him. If you want to perpetuate a lie, you would have people that they would believe, or powerful people. But for Jesus, it's always about people who are maybe a little lower in society speaking about him first. And this is another story where we get this, and it just strengthens who Jesus is. Hopefully it strengthens our faith when we read these stories. A little interesting nugget here too as well. It talked about how this mountain that she makes this comment about, this mountain that she's on. This is where they worship, not Jerusalem. For Samaritans, Mount, I'm probably not going to say it right, Gerizim, was the place that was designated for worship to God, not Jerusalem. And again, John speaks about how it's not just in the synagogues and the temples that you'll find, that you'll find God. God can be in a lot of different places. So that's probably a true statement. For them, that's where they encounter worship God, as well as others may do that in Jerusalem. This is one of these unique things to John. We go to chapter 5. We have Jesus healing a man who had been ill for well over 30 years. But poor Jesus, again, he did it on the Sabbath. You just can't do it on the Sabbath, Jesus. And he respects the law of the Sabbath, but not so much that he's not going to take care of people as well on the Sabbath, right? He believes that the law is important, but not beyond the care of people. If he had to make a choice, he's going to care for the individual. And we get this. But it makes the Jewish leaders upset, and now they're after Jesus. They're coming for him. Chapter 6, we get the feeding of the 5,000. You see these stories throughout the gospel. You also get where Jesus walks on water. And people are asking Jesus to perform some kind of sign to prove who he is. People ask questions. and I think they're fair. I mean, if this is how they know Jesus, but they ask questions. Is this not Joseph's son? How can we eat his flesh? That's interesting when he's talking about the Last Supper. How do we eat your flesh? Like, what does that mean? Like, literally eat your flesh? Like, I imagine for them hearing this the first time, it had to be pretty confusing. It had to be, head scratching. Like, what? What are you talking about, right? So I think we can have some kind of sympathy for the people questioning Jesus, but they know and they're seeing these things. Even the disciples at times question, even though they have been with him. Are you going to believe? Or are you going to continue to question what you're seeing? I think for Jesus, it's the constant complaining, nagging, the constant disbelief when he obviously is right there doing the work. You're seeing it. What else do you need to see? But Jesus is not going to put on a show for people. He's not going to prove who he is just because you're struggling with your doubt. He is doing the work. You got to make the choice. You got to make the choice of what you're seeing and what you're feeling in your heart and your eyes, that you're going to move in a life of faith. And that's part of faith. Part of faith is not having doubt. The opposite of faith is not having doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. That was something I heard from a guy named Paul Enns, who's a modern day theologian, and I think that's a lot of truth. Like they are looking for that certainty before they can believe. Well, part of having faith is believing when you don't always see everything, and so. I think it's just a challenge, and the disciples even own it. Say, man, this teaching is difficult. It is difficult. Welcome to the life of faith. Welcome to a life with Jesus. That's okay. We can own that. We can say that, but don't let it stop us from believing in Jesus and the works that Jesus is doing. He's doing amazing things, and he has laid out enough, right? They even call Jesus into question, like, tell us who you are, and he's like, I've already said. He never has said specifically that he is the Messiah, but he has implied that through his actions, through his words, and through his statements. It would be dangerous for him to actually say he is. For them, that would be blasphemous, and they would just instantly crucify him. And so he is moving a little differently because he still has work to do. So he's not going to be that explicit, but he is pretty much alluding to that with what he does and what he says. And it's up to the people. It's up to the people at that time. We go to chapter 7. Jesus skips going to Judea. Excuse me, because people want to kill him. And he says later on how with the disciples, how for the disciples, the time is always there for them to do the work, but maybe not always for him. Because him being the leader, he has to pick and choose a little different, and he's coming with the claim also that he's the Messiah. The disciples are not. They can go and teach and share about Jesus to others without making these claims like he will, like being the Messiah, that would possibly have them face immediate danger. Now, they're going to face danger for what they teach and do, but not in the same sense that Jesus is going to. So for him, he's just trying to encourage them, hey, your time is always there and available to do this. My time is going to be a little different. And so, but he also talks about how one of the reasons why this is a struggle for him is because the world hates him. He says the world hates him because he testifies against it, because its works are evil, which I think is interesting. Its works are evil. Our behaviors, our attitude towards people, how we treat others is evil, right? I love that he's not hammering people necessarily. He's hammering the actions of people, right? And that can be a real focus for us in the church, right? Easy on people, hard on the actions, hard on policies, hard on procedures. That's kind of how I manage too, is easy on people, hard on policy. But I think that's kind of the bigger part is Jesus is always easy. Even on the religious leaders, he just gets upset with their actions, with how they live out the law, and it continues to hurt and oppress people. So Jesus is always pretty focused on the actions of others, but soft on them, because all people are still created in the image of God, and even those that we really disagree with, and even Jesus asked for forgiveness on those that condemn him later on, and that's something for us to remember. Verse 43 says there was division among the people because of him. Again, I've always found it interesting when people are like, oh, church is getting political, or, this message is dividing us, or what. Well, Jesus' message doesn't just always bring people together. Some are prepared to hear it and some are not. But are we just being truthful to the gospel? And if we are, then we can rest assured. You would love for it all to bring everybody together and just sing kumbaya, but it doesn't always work that way. Jesus' message is tough for some to swallow. And I think if you look at chapter 7, look at this passage in 45 to 52. I find a parallel there. I found kind of another example of what Christian nationalism could look like, right? The leaders, the religious leaders, are upset with the police for not arresting Jesus for what he's preaching because it goes against the religious beliefs. This is how we would use Christianity in a nationalistic way to enforce our laws, right? A dominant part of Christianity would say, this is how our laws are to be governed. This is the punishments that occur. Anybody who disagrees with this, you're going to be arrested. You're going to be condemned. That is how Christian nationalism is how it works and how it has been working for people. And that's a really really dangerous thing, and I think this is a version of that. This is not Christian nationalism in Scripture because there's no Christians yet, but it is the way that people are using their religion, the dominant religion in that area, to enforce the law. And to use the government to help to enforce that law. So I think that there's some connection there with modern day Christian nationalism, and we should be warned. We should be careful with that. That should be something that we should call out. That is wrong. That is a deviation from the gospel of Jesus. So any time that we see this used in this way, and especially being used against Jesus, we should know. Red flag should go up. That's incorrect. That's not right. That's a deviation from the true gospel that Jesus preaches and lives out. We'll go into chapter 8. Chapter 8, women caught in adultery. Another story that people are usually pretty familiar with. But what's always interesting about this, people will go to this a lot of times when they talk about people being sinners, and they'll say, hey, yeah, but Jesus says go and sin no more. Yeah, you shouldn't say, like, Jesus says go and sin no more, so don't sin. Which, sure, I get that. Yeah, nobody should just choose to sin. But what's interesting is I think people kind of throw it backwards, because what Jesus does with this woman is when they want to stone her for committing adultery, which is interesting because the man couldn't commit adultery, right? Even though the man's one that's married, he goes out and actually commits adultery by our modern day definition of it. In that time, the woman couldn't sleep with a married man, but the married man could. The married man was fine, but the woman, not so much. Again, the laws were always against the women in that time, for sure. And Moses' law is we got to stone you for it, and that's just crazy. And Jesus is like, no. This is unfair. This is unjust. This doesn't need to happen. And so he says the famous word, who is without sin cast the first stone, and nobody does. They drop it, and the woman's shocked, and he asks the woman, he says, hey, I know you're shocked by this pretty much, but did anybody condemn you? And she's like, no. And he's okay, well then I don't condemn you either, right? Go and sin no more. So Jesus tells her, I do not condemn you. You are fine. You are good to go. And then he says, go and sin no more. And I think for us, we want to condemn people first and then tell them to not go sin, right? People do this to me all the time, who disagree with my way of belief, is they'll call me a sinner, say I'm going to go burn, do all these things, well, I'm just terrible and all that, and I should just repent, and they'll condemn me. But, Jesus says go and sin no more. Well, Jesus moves with grace and mercy first. Jesus doesn't bring condemnation to the woman, even though she did violate the law. He grants her grace and mercy and salvation, but doesn't want her to continue to get in trouble and put herself in dangerous situations. So don't go do that anymore, because I may not be here to save you like this. I may not be here to save you on this earthly time, but Jesus isn't one to condemn like that, because that law is set up. It does not care for a human being very well. Jesus is against those laws that don't care for the human. So again, another really good and interesting thing that I think sometimes we misuse and use it against people, and we don't do it in the right way. And I think we need to be careful about judgment and condemnation on others by what we perceive as sinful. That we should move with grace and mercy first. So you also get some really strong disagreements that are still going on with the Jewish leaders and Jesus. And this goes on for a couple chapters, really through 6 through 10, I believe, that you see a lot of these disagreements. Chapter 9, we get the healing of the blind man. Again, Jesus does it on the Sabbath. Go and get himself in some trouble still. And the disciples ask him, Jesus, who sins? This man or him? What caused him to be blind? That was a thought. Like, if you were not perfectly healthy, if you were not well off, if you did not have wealth, you obviously were doing wrong. You were sinful. And Jesus says, "No, man, this person didn't sin. Neither did his parents. People are just born this way. Sometimes these things just happen." But even though the man is blind, he's still there for the glory of God. I equate this to a young man I had in my church one time that had some severe disabilities. Couldn't really communicate well. A lot going on. But he believed in Jesus. He came to church. He would try to sing the songs. I mean, he greets you with a smile. Just one of the most lovely, most beautiful human beings that you would ever come across. And in him, I really saw a lot of unconditional love, and he just loved being around people and loved conversing with people. And in him, I could see Jesus more at times than I could see in other people. It was simple. He just simply loved people. He didn't complicate things, and it was a reminder to me that God is present in him and me and all people, no matter how or what form we come in, that we all have an opportunity to impact lives through love, right? Through loving our neighbor well. And so, yeah, this guy, obviously Jesus' miracle of restoring his sight is a way that God is going to be glorified through him. But there's many ways that I have to imagine there's many people that we encounter that we wouldn't think would be an impact because of maybe how they're dressed or where they come from, right? I mean, the way of life they have, we think, oh, poor them, or, where's God with them? But, they're not as well off. But you find that they are sometimes the most loving, most caring, most Christ-centered people that you ever will find. And so God is with all of us. God is with all of us, and He really pushes up against that narrative that if you are not blessed in some way, well, then you must be a sinner, and that is something for us in today's modern time that we should be aware of, and how we look and treat others, especially those that we would perceive as not being as well off, and that we should make sure that we welcome them fully into the life with Jesus, as Jesus continually shows us through the scriptures. So that is our first part of John. A little longer on this video, but hopefully unpack some of this stuff for you as you read through John. And we'll continue further in our reading the Bible in a year.